The Razer Viper Mini surprised the enthusiast community with its release in the spring of 2020. On paper, the mouse was very compelling, boasting impressive features for a very low $40 price tag. I was a huge fan of this mouse, owning several copies, and had used it in the past as my main driver, but with no refresh since release, I wanted to revisit the Viper Mini almost 18 months on to look at whether it's still a solid choice for budget-conscious gamers, or if it could even still be viable for competitive players and aimers too. The first thing I felt picking up the mouse again after some time away was just how natural it felt in my hand as someone who plays exclusively with small mice. The coating also felt surprisingly premium and stood up against far more expensive mice, and even Razer's own Orochi V2 as a textured, grippy plastic. The side buttons are tactile and super easy to find due to the non-textured sides, unlike the larger Viper Ultimate, which has flatter, flusher implementation and rubberized side grips. The scroll is very soft and lacks defined steps, which isn't to my preference, but I know that works for some people. Razer uses 100% PTFE skates. They're soft, they glide well, and I have absolutely no complaints using the stock skates on the Doraemon and the Sanrio editions of this mouse. For comparison, I swapped for Esports Tiger Ice on the white and modded black version of the Viper and couldn't notice any significant difference versus the stock glide. The standard black model of this mouse uses the Razer SpeedFlex cable, which isn't bad, but is quite stiff. You could still absolutely use it, but I'd probably recommend a bungee. I swapped all of my Viper Mini cords for paracords from paracablemods.co.uk, but this was largely due to aesthetics and personal preference rather than necessity. The mouse tips the scales at around 60 grams, which is still very competitive, especially at that price that the mouse sells for and the build quality that it retains at that price. Just like the larger Ultimate and 8K, the Mini uses Razer optical switches and has been upgraded to the V2 implementation from serial numbers 2041 and above. All four models in the video today are using V1, and whilst they are a lighter click, I haven't had any issues whatsoever with feel or tactility that some other people have described. Here's a quick click test to show you how they sound. I was also surprised by just how similar the Viper Mini feels to the Ultralight 2 or Starlight 12 Small, which I've been using a lot of recently for a review. There are some subtle differences between the shape of the two, but I think it will be an easy transition between the two mice if you're already comfortable with either the Viper Mini or the Ultralight 2 Starlight 12, with the Viper Mini being just a fraction of the price for a very similar feel in hand. Also, the Deluxe M800 has recently risen in popularity as a mouse with a similar shape to the Viper Mini, but offering wireless too for around $50. As someone who owns a couple of copies of the M800, the overall build quality, additional weight, terrible stock skates, and mushy side buttons don't really place it in the same league as the Viper Mini, and personally, I'd rather just use a cord and go for the Viper Mini. I've actually weight modded, painted and swapped side switches in both my M800 copies, and if you're interested in knowing how I did it, let me know in the comments down below so I can make a video on that in the future. Up until this point, I have been very positive about the Razer Viper Mini, but there are two persistent issues that you absolutely should be aware of when considering the Viper Mini as your mouse. The Viper Mini uses a textured plastic ring as a shroud around the sensor. On the Viper Ultimate and Viper 8K, this is an additional PTFE glide and not a piece of textured plastic. This shroud protrudes slightly less than the skates on a flat surface, so shouldn't be an issue for those of you that use hard pads. On softer pads, it has a much more significant detrimental impact on the glide of the mouse, where I've noticed it make almost constant contact and create a lot of drag and friction. Here's how it sounds in use against a Viper Mini that I've modded to remove this plastic shroud. I tried a few ways to resolve this. Firstly, I sanded the sensor ring completely flush to the base, but I was concerned that this might create DPI deviation, as I assume that was why the shroud was created in the first place. For my second attempt, instead of completely sanding it, I soft sanded the ring by about 20 microns, polished it smooth and rounded the edges, which removed drag entirely from hard, hybrid and cloth surfaces while still keeping the sensor shroud mostly in place. You will likely need to peel the bottom label to properly access the sensor to sand, but it can easily be replaced if you're careful for a complete stock look. I would also suggest that if you are sanding, you unscrew and remove the PCB to ensure that you don't trap any dust from the sanding in the lens and impact tracking. The Viper Mini uses the 3359 sensor, which has a stock liftoff distance of around 2.4mm, which is a lot higher than most people will be familiar with in other mice. Fortunately, since launch, Razer have taken steps to correct this, and firmware 1.03.02 released in November 2020 and seems to have helped a lot of people with this issue, myself included. Using the Razer Synapse software, I calibrated my surface to the Vespula V2 hard and set the liftoff distance range to 1mm. After doing this, I'm pleased to report that my mice have less than 1mm or 1 DVD liftoff distance, and it has completely resolved this concern. My own experience aside, other people have reported this issue persisting after the firmware update, so your mileage may vary based on the pad that you have and the calibration settings that you select in Razer Synapse. So to kick off the positives, the first is the price. This mouse is frequently available for around $30, and at that price, it's very hard to recommend any comparable mouse with an overall package that rivals the Viper Mini even after 18 months. Next is shape. Now, shape is completely subjective, but it offers a comparable experience to mice several times its price with a very competitive and safe shape for a variety of grip styles. Third is the design and general aesthetic. The Razer RGB and Chroma is used sparingly, and what you're left with is a premium looking product for a budget price with no honeycomb cutouts that's consistent with the rest of Razer Viper's design language. Additionally, it keeps its weight at around 60 grams. It's an easy mouse to suggest for anyone that's looking for an ultralight experience but might not have the budget to extend to a G Pro X Superlight or even a Starlight 12. Lastly, and quite controversially, the optical switches are a plus for me. I was initially quite cold on the optical switches, finding them soft and lacking tactility, but after some time with the Starlight 12 and how stiff and heavy the switches are, I really appreciated coming back to the Viper Mini, how easy they are to actuate, and whilst I can't speak to whether or not they gave me a competitive advantage, they certainly felt easy and comfortable to press in long gaming or aim lab sessions. Now conversely, where could Razer improve the Viper Mini? Firstly, the plastic sensor shroud. This is a real oversight and requires user modding to get the most out of an otherwise excellent mouse glide. I appreciate it could have been an engineering necessity to ensure the mouse performed as intended, but I'd have liked to have seen a revision that looked at other solutions like a PTFE shroud. Secondly, liftoff distance. Now, as firmware has fixed this for me personally, I'm hesitant to include it as an area for improvement, but seeing as this isn't a unanimous fix, it is worth noting. You should absolutely check to see if your mouse shipped with the latest firmware and experiment with Synapse calibrations to find out the best solution for you and finding the right liftoff distance for your playstyle. Lastly, wireless. After almost 18 months with the Mini being praised as a fantastic product for a fair price, the seeming lack of a wireless solution leaves you to wonder if Razer has other plans for the Mini range in the future, and instead we've seen their focus on wireless in the form of the Orochi V2. I think it's a shame that focus and attention on the Orochi V2 launch and the age of the Viper Mini has somewhat tarnished community perception of the absolutely incredible mouse that the Mini still is to this day. It's not wireless, it hasn't had a product refresh outside of Asia, and there hasn't been any additional colours, but ultimately that doesn't really matter all that much when what you're left with is a mouse that has reigned pretty much uncontested as one of the absolute best gaming mice you can get for $30 to $40 for almost 18 months. I think I was most surprised at, despite its age, just how close to the $150 to $200 mice the Viper Mini still felt in-game, and I am so glad I decided to revisit it. I think I was just as guilty of forgetting how much I enjoyed my time with it and just how much gaming potential Razer's little gem still has today. If you still rate the Viper Mini, show it some love in the comments down below, and I'll see you all in the next video.